this to create a visual, not a smell. No, with food waste, at the beginning it was pretty empty, but all these pockets expand. So come on in! Hey everyone! Alright, I need an assistant to take this off, because I'm not going to give the whole talk in the trash suit. Thanks for coming out, and thank you to everyone for putting on this event. We had no plans of coming to Vienna, but someone in the audience, who was it? Right here, she messaged Talina and said, let's have Rob come, and so here I am. Oh, I could start taking off the pants, which is actually the easy part. There we go. There we go. Okay, shoes gone. Alright, so a lot of you, some of you might have seen some of my work before, but a lot of you probably haven't, so I'll go through a couple of my projects and kind of let you know what I've been up to over the last couple of years. And I want to give you a little disclaimer before I get started. A lot of the things that I do are pretty extreme. I do a lot of extreme environmental activism and adventures, and the whole idea, I'm out of breath from that trash suit. The whole idea is to catch mainstream media's attention and catch people's attention and get them to start thinking about important environmental and social issues. So I do a lot of these things that are attention-grabbing and eye-catching, but the message is actually not to go out and be extreme necessarily. It's what can we do as individuals to live in a way that's more environmentally friendly and socially conscious. So just keep that in mind as I'm going through some of these things. So some of you might have seen my project called the Food Waste Fiasco. I've dived into about 2,000 dumpsters across the United States to show how much perfectly good food is going to waste. And this is one of my ways of showing that. You might have seen a project called People Are Good, where I flew away from San Diego to Panama, 7 countries away, 4,000 miles from home, and I landed there with just the clothes on my back and my passport. So I had sandals, shorts, a long sleeve shirt, a jacket, a hat, and my passport, and that's literally it. And I put myself down there, dependent on the kindness of others, to ultimately have a way of showing people that people are actually pretty good. Mainstream media might show a world that's very violent, but the reality that exists, but the reality is that in general most people are actually pretty good. Trash me, I'm sure all of you are at least a tiny bit familiar with that. That's the trash suit. So for 30 days I did a project where I lived just like the average American. So I ate, I shopped, and I consumed just like the average American does. And the idea was to create a visual that helps people to understand just how much trash one person creates, because we throw it in the garbage can or the recycle bin and we never really have to think about it again. Where does it really go? And how much does it add up to? So the idea of this is to create a visual of how much garbage just one person creates in a month. And then, so 13 months ago, I left my house in San Diego. I got rid of almost everything I own and was down to just 111 possessions. So everything that I own is in my backpack, which is here in Vienna right now. And the idea of this is just to get people thinking about how much stuff they have. You know, a lot of people have tens of thousands of possessions, and just getting people to think about, is more possessions what makes you happier, or would you be happier possibly with less? So again, a lot of things that are somewhat extreme, and it's about catching people's attention in a very busy world where you have thousands of things that can catch your attention on a given day, most of which don't talk about making the world a better place. But so some of you may have seen some of those adventures before, but what you probably don't know is that I wasn't always caring about the environment. I wasn't trying to live a life that was beneficial to society or anything greater than myself. So if we rewind about 10 years, this is me over here on the left. This is my friend Bennett in the middle, and here we are. This is a typical college night, drinking the cheapest beer out of the plastic cups that we picked up at the corner store. And so this was my passion for about 5, 6, 7 years, and I was about as passionate about that as I was about what I'm doing now. And so for the longest time, I had my life pretty well figured out. I was very focused on partying. I was very focused on women. My part-time job, maybe 20 or 30 hours a week, was pursuing women and inviting them to my parties. My goal was to be a millionaire by the time that I was 30 years old, so I was very money-focused. And every Sunday, I spent 2 hours shining my car. So I was very focused on material possessions. I was having a good time, and I was very passionate about this. So this right here is something that maybe none of you have done. It was actually a rare moment. It's called a duck bong. So you've probably heard of a beer bong, but this is an ornamental lawn duck, and you cut the foot off and the beak, and it's hollow inside, so you fill it up with beer, and then the beer just funnels right through the duck's throat and into your throat and into your stomach. So we were very creative about how we could fit as much beer as we possibly could into our stomachs in a short period of time. And this is where I spent a lot of my time. When I wasn't successful with my part-time job of pursuing women, I found unlucky Christmas trees and things like that. So this is where my head was at for a long time. And the point of showing that is just to show where I came from. So after university, I was still, I was definitely on this path, still wanted to be a millionaire and still spent a lot of my time at bars and things like that. And I moved out to San Diego in 2011. And what happened was I started to watch a lot of documentaries and read some books, and I started to realize, I just started to learn about all the problems that existed in the world, both the environmental problems and the social problems. And up to that point, I had actually kind of considered myself to be the environmentally friendly one. So at the parties, I was the one that was recycling all the beer bottles and the beer cans. My roommate Ricky, I actually got in fights with him when he would leave the water running while he was brushing his teeth with the water on, and I put the energy efficient bulbs into our college house. And so I actually had thought that I was living a fairly environmentally friendly life. But through these documentaries, I started to realize that all of my daily actions were causing environmental and social destruction to the very things that I loved. I had studied biology, chemistry, and aquatic science. I was an outdoorsman and someone who loved nature and loved animals. But ultimately, I realized the food that I was eating was coming from factory farms, causing, destruction to many of the species that exist on Earth. The food that was coming from the GMO cornfields, the trash that I was creating that was ending up in landfills or ending up in the oceans or the forests, the gasoline that I was pumping into my car that was a part of the 10,000 routine oil spills that happen per year, and that I was contributing to war where that oil comes from. And so I just realized that all of my daily actions pretty much were causing destruction and were not actually protecting the world that I loved at all. And so at that time, I could have felt very much depressed. I could have felt total doom and gloom and just hopeless and helpless, like there was nothing I could do. But I had those moments, but ultimately, instead I actually started to feel really empowered, because here was this information. I had watched all these documentaries and read the books, and now I knew the problems, and I knew ways that I could be a part of the solution. So what I did is I made this long list of changes that I wanted. Just seeing what, yep, that's still up there. I made this long list of changes that I wanted to make in my life, and I hung it up in a prominent place in my kitchen. So it was a list of like 2 computer pages long, and I put a pen with a string next to it and hung it up there, and my goal was to check off one thing per week. So it was simple things like carrying a reusable bag and ditching plastic bags, starting to shop local, and at the time I would go to Walmart for everything I need. My food came from Walmart, my cheap goods came from Walmart, so starting to shop at local farmers markets. Another, so starting to support local businesses rather than these big box marts. Another one was starting to eat different. So a big one was trying to eat more unpackaged, unprocessed foods. I was realizing a lot of the things that I was putting in my body by reading the ingredients lists were not really food at all. So I started to eat a more whole food diet. So as an example here, popcorn. Instead of buying the buttered popcorn in the package and microwaving it, just popping my own and starting to eat more whole foods, eating a lot more fruits and vegetables, so making those sorts of changes. Another big one was that one of my early inspirations was a short film called The Story of Stuff. And they also have a short film called The Story of Cosmetics. And I started to realize that all this stuff that I was putting on my body was made of petroleum byproducts and had all these crazy ingredients that I had no desire to put in my body. So I took all those and I just put them on the curb. The lotion and the Listerine mouthwash and the Old Spice deodorant and the Lucky cologne. And I don't need these things to exist, so I decided to try it out. And ultimately, through all of this, I just started to realize that a lot of the things I were doing were just because that's what the corporations had sold me to do. So I decided I'm not going to spend hundreds of dollars on these things anymore that ultimately cause destruction. Also, I started to spend more time giving back. So rather than going to the bar with friends, I would say, hey, how about we go clean up the trash on the beach? Or how about we try to start a community bike program or things like that? And so trying to focus on a way that I could make the community better that I was living in rather than just self-service. I also started to ride a bike more and drive less. And ultimately what happened is that the more that I started to do all these things, I was becoming a lot happier and healthier. So riding my bike, for example, I was just so much happier than driving a car and pounding my head against the steering wheel in traffic. And so the more that I was making these positive changes in my life, the more they became a lot easier, because as I became happier and healthier, the next step became a lot easier. So ultimately what I found after about 2 years of making positive changes, if you make one positive change a week for 2 years, that's about 100 positive changes. So what I did is I built a foundation, and as I built up that foundation of living a more environmentally friendly life, each thing became slightly easier. So then I decided, a lot of, I saw from, my experience that a lot of people don't have an opportunity to get to learn about these things. Here in Austria, it might be a little different, but in the United States, it's not like the commercials are coming on and telling you, just drink water and get enough sleep and eat healthy food. They're telling you to buy stuff that you don't need, and that's the general message. So I decided I wanted to take this message across the country and be able to give people an opportunity to live about sustainable living and how we can live more environmentally friendly. So I came up with a bike ride. It was called Off the Grid Across America, and the idea was to try to live as environmentally friendly of a life as I possibly could. So to bike across the country with no negative impact whatsoever. And so in order to do that, I had to set some ground rules of how I was able to live. So I focused on all of the things that we deal with on a daily basis that we don't really think about necessarily. So food, water, energy, waste, transportation, all of the key aspects of personal sustainable living. So for food, the rule was that I could only local, organic, unpackaged food all the way across the country. So local meant it came from the state that I was in. Organic meant that it didn't mean that it had to be certified, but that I went to the farm and they told me where it came from and that it wasn't covered in pesticides. And unpackaged just meant no packaging was on the food. So in California, that was pretty easy because California produces about half of the United States food. But once I got past California, things became a lot more difficult because there's what we have is called food deserts, where there's no access to healthy food. You can't even find a banana shipped from halfway around the world that's covered in pesticides, not even a banana. So I had made one exception, and that was that I could eat food that was going to waste, because if it was already going to waste, I might as well eat it. So at this time, I had never been dumpster diving before. I still had a pretty good ego. This was in 2013, so I still worried quite a bit what people would think about me. So, but I needed carbohydrates because I was biking and I wasn't able to find that locally, so I had to go to the dumpster. So I just rode around back of the grocery store, and I kind of like peered inside very timidly, and I looked in, and sure enough, there was food in there. So I hopped in, and the first piece of food that I ever ate out of a dumpster was a still frozen half-gallon of Moose Tracks ice cream. And I didn't have a spoon, so I took my sunglasses and just dug right in. And ultimately, what I saw was that on this bike ride, I'd keep going into the grocery stores, and they'd always not have anything local or organic or unpackaged. So I would start to just roll around back, and ultimately I found that dumpster after dumpster after dumpster is filled with perfectly good food. So that summer, about 70% of everything that I ate came from grocery store dumpsters. And one thing, so at this time, I was very much in love with this girl, and she told me on the phone as I was biking across the country, don't tell anyone you're dumpster diving. So if you read my very earliest blogs, you would have read something like, I was biking along and I found a loaf of bread. And I wouldn't say where it came from, but we'll get back to that at the end. So for water on this trip, the rule was I could only use water that came from natural bodies, so lakes and rivers or rain. So that meant no turning on a faucet, no taking a shower, no washing my clothes in a washing machine, no flushing a toilet or using a flush toilet for an entire summer. Water only from natural sources. So I had a little purifier with me, and that's where I got my drinking water and my cooking water. This was a moment in Michigan where I just sat out in the rain and soaked it up. But I had an exception for that as well, and that was that I could use water that was going to waste. So right here is a leak that was coming out of a fire hydrant in Brooklyn. And so I measured that leak, and it was 2 gallons or 7 liters of water per minute. So that means it's 770 gallons of water per day, or about 3,000 liters. So that one leak was enough water to meet the drinking needs of 1,440 people. So for 5 hot summer days in Brooklyn, this was my watering hole. I bathed in it. As you can see here, I was wearing shorts, so I wasn't naked in the streets. I brushed my teeth in there. I did my laundry with it, and brought the water home to cook food in it. And that was my only source of water for 5 summer days. So for electricity, for the entire summer, I couldn't use any electricity that I didn't generate myself. So no turning on a light, no using an oven or a refrigerator, no turning on air conditioning when it's hot or a fan. So no using electricity in any of the ways that we were used to. But then it was other things, like for example, if I wanted to walk into a store and they only had automatic doors, I'd have to wait till someone else walked in and just like hop in behind them. Or if I wanted to cross the street, I couldn't touch the button to get across. I just had to wait there. And if I was biking at night and an automatic light went off, I'd have to stop, turn around, and unscrew that automatic light so that it wasn't on any longer. So by doing this, I started to really understand how much electricity I was using, how electrified my life was. So this is the little solar panel that I had for charging my cell phone and my bike lights. And then I also had this larger solar panel. It was 30 watts, and that's what I would use to charge my laptop. So I had made one exception, and that was that I could log on to Wi-Fi, even knowing that I'd probably be burning some electricity by the router or the modem, using a little bit more. But I made that exception so that I'd be able to blog and upload photos and tell people about the journey. But as I really started to dive into sustainable living and really tried to understand my actions, I started to learn things deeper than I ever would have imagined. So for an example here, I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I stopped by a company that their job is to get huge companies like Facebook and Google to switch over to alternative energy, solar and wind farms rather than fossil fuels. And so what I learned as I was talking to them is that when I put stuff online on the cloud, what the cloud is just a name for someone else's computer. And these other computers, they're using all this electricity. For one, it has to be cooled because you have this giant room of computers. So ultimately what I learned is that every time I put something online, a blog or a YouTube video or a picture on Facebook, that my life was consuming that much more electricity at every single moment of the day, whether I was asleep or awake. So by doing this, I was just able to really start to understand more deeply how my life interacted with the world around me. For trash, the rule was the opposite of trash me. I had to try to create as little trash as I could, but any trash that I did create, I had to carry all the way across the country with me. So anybody who's done a bike ride or a hiking trip knows that every time you can get rid of a little bit of weight, you do that because it adds up. So the idea was that by having to carry it, it would force myself to use as little as possible, because if I created a lot of trash, I wouldn't have been able to make it across the country. So in 104 days, I created 1 kilo of trash, or 2 pounds of trash, which is what the average person creates in the United States by about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on any given day, and here in Austria by nighttime. You're about twice as good as we are in the States. And then lastly, for transportation, I had to bike all the way across the country without using any fossil fuels. So no getting into a car, no getting into public transportation. And so I biked 4,700 miles, and all but one of them I did on the bike. 1 mile was a ferry ride into Manhattan. But what was beautiful about this is that I really started to learn by being on this bike trip is that cycling is something really that's accessible to so many more people than I ever would have imagined. I met 70-year-old women that were cycling across the country. I met 10-year-olds that cycled to school. And I met people that were far larger than you would ever imagine would fit on a bike that were biking to work every single day. So I started to understand the power of the bike and how far it can take you. So this trip really started to change my mindset and my perspective, and started to see what was possible by embarking on this journey. And when I got back to San Diego at the end of 2013, I still was learning about ways that I wanted to change my life. So after this trip, for example, I realized that all my money was in Chase Bank. And what I realized is it was being used, what they do with the money is they invest in fossil fuel infrastructure projects. So I realized here I was making all these changes, but my money is being used to invest in these very projects that I'm fighting against. So I had to take all my money out of the big banks and switch to a local credit union. And same with my investments. I realized that my retirement fund, the mutual funds and the Roth IRA that I had, was invested in fossil fuel and cigarettes and things like that I didn't support. So I had to take all my money out of there. And the other big one is realizing that I didn't need a trash can anymore. After having done that, I was able to take the trash cans out of my house and have one outside that would be emptied very rarely, but so that I was creating very little trash. And then January 1st, 2015, I decided that I really wanted to take this whole thing a step further in the city, because I was living in an apartment still, and I found that by living in the apartment where lights exist when you just flip the switch, and where unlimited water exists when you just turn on the faucet, that I was more wasteful than I wanted. So I went on to Craigslist on the morning of New Year's Day 2015, and I was looking to buy a camper so that I could live in that while building a tiny house where I could live off the grid. And I went on and I started to scroll down, and I saw this, and it said it was $950. And I thought, surely that must be a typo. It must be $9,500 for a pretty cool looking tiny house. So I put $950 in my pocket. I called the guy up. He was there, and I said, all right, I'm going to bike up and check it out. And for some reason, I put the $950 in my pocket, even though I said that I wasn't going to buy it. But then I bought it. And the reason, I realized why it was only $950. And the reason is because it was basically a shed, like a garden shed on wheels. It didn't even really qualify as a tiny house. I called it a tiny house, but it was too tiny and too simple to really be referred to as a tiny house. But this is like way bigger than actual size. So it was 5 feet wide. So it was about this wide, a little less, and then it was 10 feet long. So from here to about here. and it was about this tall. I had to duck down to get in it. But I thought, I like to do extreme things to get people thinking about stuff. And in the United States and in much of Europe, the average sized house has gone from 1,500 square feet, which would be 150 square meters about. But the average sized house has doubled over the last couple of decades. But at the same time, we're not seeing health and happiness doubling at all. And if anything, we're seeing health and happiness decreasing. So I figured, well, I could get people to think about, is their giant house full of stuff really making them happier and healthier, and use this as a way to catch people's attention. So I wanted to live without a single bill or debt to my name. So that was the idea in part of living off the grid. So I had one last bill, and that was my cell phone. So I got rid of that. And then in order to live bill-free and debt-free, I did a work exchange. So I put out a blog that said I was looking for a home for my tiny home, and that in exchange for someone's unused backyard, I would improve the place. So I'd build rainwater harvesting and composting bin and raised bed gardens and improve the place so that we were able to benefit each other without having to make it a monetary exchange. And so I tried to live, again, with the least environmental impact as I could. So here I grew a good portion, not a good portion, about a small portion of my food, because I was living in a desert in a mega drought. So it was not exactly easy to produce a ton, but I had these wicking bed gardens here, which were more efficient in order to grow some of my own food. So all of my water here came from rainwater, and so a lot of people would think that would be very impossible. Here in Vienna, I think you probably have no shortage of rainwater, so it's a little different. But in San Diego in 2015, we were right in the middle of a mega drought, and so people would have thought that it would be completely impossible. And this is really through all of this where I've learned that everything is a matter of perspective. So, when the news reported on this thing, they would say something like, Ocean Beach man is using 95% less water than the average San Diegan, and it's extreme, 95% less. So you have the average American that's using about 100 gallons of water per day. You have the average European that's using about 50 gallons of water per day. And then you have the average African that's using about 2 to 5 gallons of water per day. So to the average American, it's extreme to use 2 to 5 gallons. But to the average African that would be put into a house in the United States where they're leaving the water running while they're brushing their teeth, that's also extreme. So what I've learned is that everything, especially with sustainable living, but really everything is a matter of perspective. And when you change your perspective, you can totally change the world around you. So I was able to use just rainwater by using it efficiently. So for example, I would use all the water 2 to 3 times. After I used the water to, say, wash the dishes, it would go down into a bucket, and then I would use that to grow food with. So that was I was able to make my water go a lot further. So for electricity, I was able to live off these very small solar panels. And one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that the more that you simplify your needs, the easier it is to meet them. So a lot of people think that sustainable living is something that only wealthy people can do. And when you look at the movement where sustainable living is having a $90,000 Tesla and a $20,000 solar system on the roof, then it is something that's mostly only accessible to people who are wealthy. But what I've learned is that it is accessible to everyone. It's just there's a whole spectrum of how you can do it. So the reason that I was able to live sustainably and have 100% of my electricity come from these small solar panels is because I had simplified the amount of electricity that I needed. So for me, one of the things that I had really been striving for a couple of years and was kind of my holy grail, something that I never would have thought 5 years ago when I was that college guy, but something I was so excited about was the idea of pooping in a 5-gallon bucket. That's this right here, the compost toilet. And so this is something that I was really excited about. And the reason is I started to realize that every time something is easy or convenient, what that meant is that the burden had been placed elsewhere. It was outsourced. So to give you an easy example, most people in this room have probably driven a car. So you have your ankle on the gas pedal, and then you're going 0 miles per hour, and then you simply move your foot forward, and now you're going 60 miles per hour. Very easy compared to walking or riding a bike. So in that case, it's easy, it's convenient. So where's the work? In that scenario, it's been outsourced into the environment. So for example, you have the 10,000 oil spills that happen per year. So water that's being all mucked up. You have the people that live next to the oil refineries, where they have a 4 times higher rate of cancer because of all the pollutants in the air. You have so all of those sorts of things that are happening from using the fossil fuels. So that's where the convenience or the burden has been placed. So I started to think of something that's really easy is just flushing a toilet. You just hit that lever, and then your poop's gone, and you never really have to think about it. So I started to think about what is going on with that. And so, but ultimately I realized, with all of that, even in a place where water is abundant, to have that water come to you, it takes a lot of electricity that's pumped. You also have all the chemicals that are used to clean that water before it gets to you and then after it gets to you. You have the millions, or actually it's billions of taxpayer dollars that goes into the system that creates the purification and the removal of the poop. So ultimately I realized that that's what it was. So I decided that I wanted to try to do it in a way that was more self-sufficient and where I didn't create a waste source, but instead created a product that could actually be used. So this is a compost pile. And so when I started to talk about this, also I was fairly timid about being the guy who, dealt with his own waste, because it was something that very few people I had ever heard of. I mean, people do it, many people do it, but it wasn't something that was really talked about. And so I would get, of course, comments on my Facebook page and my YouTube channel. There would be things like either A, this guy is definitely going to die, so there's that. Or they would say, well, this guy is going to kill the entire city of San Diego with this. And so for that, I had an easy explanation. I was able to explain that how composting works. We call this in English humanure, which is human manure, humanure. And so how it works is that when you have a compost pile, whether it's got human waste or not, it could be just food waste and yard waste. What happens is you have all these microorganisms and macroorganisms, and what they do is they break things down in there. So you've got bacteria, that's the microorganisms, and you've got macroorganisms, that's the beetles and the larvae and the worms. And what they do is they're eating the nutrients in there, and they're breaking things down, and they create, one of the byproducts of that is heat. So a compost pile that's functioning properly will heat up to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 65 or 70 degrees Celsius. So all of the pathogens in our body, your bacteria, your viruses, those are designed to live at about body temperature. So once they're heated up, that's all killed. So I was able to explain that to people, and I felt like that went over pretty well. But the thing that I wasn't able to explain is you also had the comments saying things like, ew, this guy's eating food that his poop is used to grow. And I was like, yeah, I mean, you got me there. I don't have a really good rebuttal or response to that. But when I was doing Trash Me in September, I actually learned something that I hadn't known before. So I was in New York City. So New York City has about 8 million people living there. So imagine 8 million poops. It's per day. It's a huge amount. So what happens with that is it's all sent to a wastewater treatment plant. But along with that, you have all of the other things that go down the toilet. So you've got the pharmaceuticals, you've got the Drano and the chlorine, the bleach, and things like that. And so ultimately, you have a super toxic poop slurry. We're going to talk about poop for just a couple more minutes here. It's my favorite part of the talk. So you have this super toxic poop slurry. And what happens is it's biodigested, so it shrinks down to about 10% of the size. So 8 million poops turns into the equivalency of about 800,000 poops. Still a huge amount of stuff. So what do you do with all that in New York City or even a place like Vienna? What do you do with all of that? So what I learned is that it's baked and it's turned into a compost. It's shipped on rail down to Texas and Florida, and then lo and behold, it's used to grow Americans' food. So then what I saw is that these people are eating, and there's also the motor oil and stuff like that. So they're eating this super toxic, they're eating food that's off of this super toxic poop compost, and at least mine was just from myself and my friends, and it wasn't toxic at all. So ultimately what I learned is that most of the time when we think we know, a lot of the times we really don't know. So that's the end of the poop talk, but we will open it up to poop talk questions at the end. So for trash, I just tried to create as little trash as I possibly could. This was about 2 to 4 weeks of trash normally, so usually a month's worth of trash would fit into a 1-gallon bag or a 4-liter bag. And then for transportation, so at the tiny house, for the most part, I would ride my bike everywhere I went, but if I was feeling lazy or something like that, then I would grab a car to go, which you actually have here. And so for me, one of the most freeing things that I ever did in my entire life was the day that I decided to get rid of my car. And before that, so I'm sure that this is the case here, maybe not quite as strong, but your car, when you get your driver's license in the States, it's at age 16, it's kind of your biggest source of freedom. It's your ability to get away from your parents and go where you want, when you want. And then there's also the image. To a large extent, you kind of are the image of your car. You heavily relate to that. So this was my identity, my car, for such a long time, and what I thought was my freedom. But ultimately, what happened is I started to calculate how much money I was spending per year on my car between insurance and registration, maintenance, and gas. And I calculated it was about $7,000 per year. So the average American, what that means, and that fell in line with the average person. So what I realized is that meant the average person is working January and February of every single year just to pay for their car. So I started to think, you're telling me I could just take January and February off of every single year instead of owning a car? That sounds like a really good plan to me. And ultimately I found that one of the most freeing things that I ever did was deciding to live without a car. In San Diego, when I did need a car, I was able to use Car2Go, which is actually here in Vienna, right? I saw a couple on the road. So the more that I was doing all of this stuff, the more that I wanted to be able to raise awareness about these important issues that I was learning about. And food waste is one that I never planned on really getting into, but the more that I learned about it, the more I realized it's one of the most pressing environmental and social issues of our time. So socially, it's pretty easy to understand. 1/3 of food in the world goes to waste, while over 1 billion people are food insecure, and we have tens of thousands of people dying of starvation. Here in Austria and in the United States, you don't have starvation, but you have people that are food insecure and hungry. So it's pretty simple. We're wasting all this food. We have enough food to feed the entire world, yet so many people are hungry. So that's a big problem, fairly easy to understand. I also started to really learn that it's one of the most pressing environmental issues of our time, though, because when you take an apple, it's easy to think, okay, I'll just compost it, or just think of that apple. But what we don't realize is that when we waste that, we waste everything that went into producing it in the first place. So for example, you have all the water that goes into producing it. One banana is 70 liters or 20 gallons of water to produce that one banana. You have all the electricity. 20% of all electricity that's used is for pumping water, so you waste all of that electricity. All of the pesticides that are used to grow it. All of the fossil fuels that are used either in the field or shipping it around the world. So, and then also all the land space. When we waste 1/3 of our food, that means we're wasting 1/3 of all of the land used to grow food that could be natural habitat instead. So the more that I learned that, the more that I wanted to really raise awareness about it. And so I wanted to take everyone to the dumpster with me, But I knew that just wasn't really feasible or possible. So I decided to take the dumpster to America. So I would go out dumpster diving for 1 day, sometimes 2 days, and I would take everything I found to the park. So this is Burlington, Vermont. This is 2 days with the dumpster diving with the college students there. This is Chicago, Illinois. So to give you a bit of a perspective, the perimeter of this is 104 frozen pizzas. So if I start right here, it's about 9 people wide. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's about how wide this was. And this is just 2 days of dumpster diving in Chicago, Illinois. My next stop after Chicago was Detroit, Michigan. And when I woke up in Detroit, it was 7 o'clock on a Sunday. I had a demonstration planned for 5 o'clock that night, so 10 hours later. Hadn't been out dumpster diving yet, so I was fairly worried. I didn't know if I'd be able to pull it off. And the thing was, I was under pressure because already some major media was planning on being there, USA Today and Discovery Channel and some of the local papers, so I was really pretty worried. Seth and Julie picked me up with their SUV at about 7:15. They had never been dumpster diving before, and this is the amount of food that we had collected by 9 a.m. So less than 2 hours of dumpster diving in Detroit with 2 people that had never been dumpster diving before, who had an SUV. And ultimately what I found is that our only limitation on any of these was the size of the vehicle that we had to transport all the food. This is Cleveland, Ohio, so this is a day where it was 30 degrees Celsius, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So most of the food was spoiled already, and this is just the good stuff that we managed to pull out in 7 hours. Enough bananas to feed everybody in here, at least 1 banana for sure. This is Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This was a more rural part of the United States, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do it, but this is 4 hours of dumpster diving in Lancaster. This is Los Angeles, California. This is the city that has the second largest homeless population in the United States, and this is just a tiny sample of the amount of food that's going to waste. And so this is Orlando, Florida, and back to I told you at the beginning, there was that one girl who on the phone when I was biking across the country told me, whatever you do, don't tell anybody you're dumpster diving. I was very much in love with her at the time. I don't know if I mentioned that, so I kind of listened to her. But after a while, I just thought, why am I still holding? I'm not talking on the phone anymore. After I just started to see how big of an issue it was, I started to kind of think, this is more important than myself. So against her desire, I started to dumpster dive. I just started to raise awareness about it. And so here we are. She's now my girlfriend. Her name is Cheryl. We've been together for 2.5 years. And she doesn't go dumpster diving, or she doesn't go in the dumpster with me, but she does stand next to the dumpster, and then I pass the food out to her. So ultimately, this is proof that you can eat the trash and have the girl too. So one of the most important lessons that I've learned through all of this is the biggest thing that held myself back and holds a lot of people I know back is social stigmas, worrying what people are going to think about you. And ultimately what I've seen is that when you really open yourself up and you become more vulnerable, but you're passionate about what you're doing and you're living a purposeful life, ultimately more people see that authenticness inside of you and they want to be around you. They're drawn to that. In a world that's so unauthentic or inauthentic, people are drawn to that. So if there's maybe one tip I could give to everybody, it would be stop worrying what people think about you and instead just do what's good for the world, good for your community, and good for yourself. This is San Diego, California. All right. Oh, that's right. So people would always ask me, what did you do with all this food? And so my goal with all of the food waste demonstrations wasn't to feed one person here and one person there, because that's a great thing, but I just felt like it wasn't quite big enough. I wanted to feed millions of people by changing the system that we have. But people would always ask me, I'd start to lay out the food and they'd say, what are you doing? And I would say, we're raising awareness about food waste and we're laying it all out. And they're like, well, are you selling it? And I'm like, no, we're not selling it. It's from the dumpster. And they'd say, then, well, can we have it? And I'd always say, well, sure, of course. And so every time at the beginning, before I'd even have a chance to finish setting up the food, a lot of it would already be taken. So after I had done this for a while, I made kind of a rule, and that was that the demonstration would be, say, from 11 to 3, and then at 3 o'clock I would say, okay, the food is for the taking now. So this is sometime before 3 o'clock, and then this is 3 o'clock and 30 seconds. So the more that I did these demonstrations, the more that I realized that this food being thrown away is not half-eaten plates of spaghetti. It's not apples with bites out of it. It's not spoiled food. It's perfectly good. And the reason I was able to see that is because people from all walks of life ate this food from dumpsters. We had 80-year-olds down to 40-year-olds down to 1-year-olds. We had people that lived on the streets who didn't have a meal that night, all the way up to millionaires. And so the more that I saw this, is the more that I realized that this food is definitely still good. So my most recent project was Trash Me, and that was in September of last year. And one of my big inspirations for this was Morgan Spurlock. He has a documentary called Super Size Me, where he eats McDonald's, also known as trash, for 30 days. And so he was really successful at getting people to think about fast food in a different way. And so I thought, how can I apply this to trash? How can I do something that really grabs people's attention like Morgan did and relate that to an important environmental issue, how much trash we create? So I came up with Trash Me, like Super Size Me, but Trash Me. So for 30 days, I had to eat like the average American, shop like the average American, and consume like the average American does. But I had to wear every piece of trash that I created. So I'd go to the grocery store, I'd look what other people had in their shopping carts, and then I'd go and buy that. I'd go to the restaurant, I'd say, what does everybody get here? I went to McDonald's for the first time. You can see the McDonald's fries right here. I went to McDonald's for the first time in about 5 years, and I said, what do people eat? And they said, a Big Mac with meal. So that's what I got. It was really a weird moment in my life. Taylor Swift was on the radio and started to cry a little bit. I think the burger's hormones kind of threw me off a little bit. It was like up and down, up and down. It was a pretty interesting experience. But anyway, that's a segue of this whole thing. But the idea was just to create a visual that helped people understand how much trash they make as an individual. They throw it in the garbage can and they never have to think about it, and they never see how much it adds up to. And the idea was just to show how much it really adds up to. So this is 30 days of living like the average person in the United States, and this is ultimately about 1/3 less trash than the average person creates. So I wasn't able to create as much trash as the average person, so it's a little bit, it's 1/3 less. But ultimately, this represents about the same amount that the average person in Austria would create. That includes trash and recycling. And so it was about getting to think about these actions. Here I am eating at Panera Bread, and if you take something like that, or say a bag of potato chips, you eat that bag of you eat the chips inside there for, say, 5 minutes, and then that plastic bag is going to be around when your kids are walking on Earth. So just thinking about that action and the impact that it has. So by the end, it got pretty heavy, and I spent a lot more time sitting. So there was my ups and there was my downs. It was quite an enjoyable project, actually, because as you saw, it's fun being the guy wearing the trash. Everybody is like excited about it. So I had actually a really good time for the most part. But there were those down days, the days that I didn't leave my house at all because I didn't want to put on the trash suit. But ultimately, the most depressing day of the entire time was the day that I visited the recycling facility. I walked in and a cold feeling just poured through my heart, and I thought, this is what we call saving the planet. On Earth Day, we say recycle and save the planet. And I thought, surely this is not saving the planet. This does not look like the environmentally friendly thing to do. And so what I've learned is that recycling, obviously it's much better than than putting our stuff in the landfill. But ultimately, it's an extremely resource and energy intensive process. So this recycling facility was gigantic. It was probably about a square block. And so the whole thing was lined with solar panels. So awesome. And all of those solar panels only generated enough electricity to power the lights on the roof. So that's how much electricity it takes just for recycling. So it's a really energy and resource intensive process. So now a more happy moment, because that's a little depressing. So I've always believed that one person can actually make a really positive impact on the world. It's something that I've believed a long time, that our actions do matter. And this project, more than any other project that I've ever done before, really helped to instill that into me. Because just think, this is 30 days of living like the average person and creating trash. So multiply that by 12 and imagine a year. I wouldn't have even been able to walk into this room, not even close. Now multiply that by 10 years. Multiply that by 80 years. So in a lifetime, you can make a small mountain of trash. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's also all the trash behind the scenes that you don't see. So in one lifetime, you can make a mountain of trash, or you could leave no mountain of trash at all. And that is just, so that's an example of how much of an impact you can have by making small changes in your life. And that's just one aspect. So imagine, by making changes throughout your life, the massive impact you can have, even if you never inspire anyone else to make changes, or you don't become an activist or anything of that sort. Just by dealing with our own actions, we're able to create a massively positive, massively different legacy when we leave the earth. So again, a lot of the things that I do are quite extreme to get people thinking about these issues and keep it also fun and exciting so that it's not so dreadful. But the idea isn't to cover yourself in trash or bike across Austria living off the grid, or live in a 50 square foot tiny house, or own just 100 possessions. You can do all of those things if you want to, but the idea is, what can we do as individuals at home, at school, at work, to live in a way that's more environmentally friendly and more socially responsible. So I've put some of these down here for you, and I've broke it down into the 5 key aspects of sustainable living: food, water, energy, waste, and transportation. And I'll just give you some of these tips. And so all of these are on my website as well, so you don't have to write them down. So food is just at robgreenfield.tv/food, and the same for water, energy, waste, and transportation. So, and the thing is, you'll see, like, as I said, I do a lot of extreme campaigns, but when it comes to all of this, it's not that you have to be extreme. It's more about moderation. So you don't have to go 100% zero waste, or eat a 100% plant-based diet, or waste no food at all. It's about just doing a better job, not about trying to be perfect. So for food, some of the things you can do are eat local food. So try to eat food that's from Austria. Organic or natural food that isn't grown on monoculture farms that use a lot of pesticides. Unpackaged, which a lot of the times I know it's hard to get organic and unpackaged. And the important thing to remember is you're not always going to be able to be perfect, but you can follow a set of guidelines to help decrease your environmental impact. Whole foods, so foods that are typically one ingredient. So potatoes rather than potato chips, or apples rather than applesauce. So foods that are in the same shape as they were when they came out of the ground. One of the things you can do is grow your own food. And a lot of people, this can be their kind of moment of enlightenment. You put a seed in the ground, and then all of a sudden you've got this abundant supply of tomatoes. And so for a lot of people, that can be just a life-changing moment to see where your food actually comes from and how it works. You can eat seasonally, so eating food that's growing at that time. So if you go to the grocery store in January and you see strawberries in Vienna, then you know those aren't probably local. You know that they're probably grown somewhere far away. So eating seasonally. One of the nicest things we can do with our food is simply eat it instead of throwing it away. So even the average person wastes about 25% of our food.
So that means if you go to the grocery store and you have 4 bags, you just throw one of those on the ground, and that's what we're typically doing as individuals. So simply eating our food is awesome. And then the biggest one is actually eating a more plant-based diet. So more fruits and vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, and less animal products, less meat, less dairy, and eggs and all of that. And so the reason why is that meat is the most resource intensive. So 1 pound of beef takes about 10 pounds of grain to produce. So that's, if you just eat those grains instead, it shows that how much more resources it takes to create that. So it takes a lot more land, takes a lot more food to feed animals. So that's the biggest one actually, is eating a more plant-based diet. Really, as far as the largest environmental impact, plant-based would be on the top. So for water, actually it goes with the plant-based diet as well, more fruits and veggies. So to give you an idea, I did a project where I went an entire year without showering. So imagine from today on not taking a shower for an entire year. Imagine how much water you would save. That is the equivalent of 6 hamburgers. So two months of showering is the equivalent of 1 hamburger and the amount of water that it takes. So all of these other things are huge, but important to do. But ultimately, this is where we use the most water, the food that we're eating. So other things you can do, flush the toilet less. If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. That's a saying that we have in English. Taking shorter showers, growing food, not lawns. This is one of the beautiful ones. Instead of growing a lawn that you don't really use, grow some food. Get something out of that water. Harvesting rainwater. A lot of these things, people can complicate and they can make it really seem like something that has to be expensive, but harvesting rainwater can be as simple as putting some big old buckets under your gutter and collecting that water. All these things can be done in a very simple way that don't require you to go to the store and buy stuff and spend a lot of money. Also, they're all pretty much designed to save you money as well. So putting efficient faucets on, planting native, so planting things that naturally exist so that they need less work. And then gray water, so water in the shower or the sink, using that to water your garden. So that way you're using that water multiple times. So the nice thing about that is if you set up your laundry so that the laundry water with biodegradable soap goes to your fruit trees, when you're showering, you can feel good knowing that you're growing apples every time that you shower. So for energy, so using less heating and air conditioning. So, there's all sorts of cool, interesting ways to do it. Like rather than heating up an entire room at night, you can boil up some water and put it in a bottle and put that in your coat, and that keeps you warm, much more efficient. Turning things off when you're not using them, unplugging things. So a lot of things have what's called a phantom draw. So when something's plugged in, even if it's off, it can be pulling electricity out of the wall. So unplugging things when you're not using them. Switching to energy efficient bulbs. There's a saying, a penny saved is a penny earned. And so with LED bulbs, you're going to be earning money in 3 to 12 months typically. So it's something that pays for itself because it uses so much less electricity. Washing clothes less and hang drying. Finding electricity-free alternatives. Alternative energy, so putting solar on your roof, or if you can't do that, say you live in an apartment, then supporting a renewable energy co-op and supporting them. And then one of the biggest ones is just nature. The more time that we spend outside in the park or out in the woods hiking, the less that we're consuming electricity. And then waste. So everyone here has heard the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. They actually go in that order where recycle is last. So a lot of people would think that when you start to live a zero waste lifestyle, what that means is you want to recycle more. But what that really means is you want to actually try to recycle less. First reduce, then reuse, then recycle. So the 5 R's are refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. So bring your own. So bring your own reusable water bottle or coffee cup or utensils, plates. Anytime where there's something that would be using disposable items, instead bring your own so that you don't have to use that. Saying no to disposable items. So anything that you're going to use one time and then throw away, find a reusable alternative. So other things, buying unpackaged food. What's the name of the zero waste shop here? Huh? Lutzas? Yeah. Huh? Oh, there's a couple. So going to either of those 2 zero waste shops so you can buy your food unpackaged. Buying used, so rather than buying things brand new, buying used stuff, that way it doesn't have packaging on it. Repairing stuff when it breaks rather than throwing it away. Donating stuff to thrift stores and nonprofits or giving it to friends when you don't need it anymore rather than throwing it away. Buying quality things that last, so buying clothes that you can wear for 10 years rather than a shirt that wears out after one season. And composting. And then lastly, transportation. So one of the biggest ones is to not own a car. Instead, use public transportation, bike, and walk. If you do want to own a car, you can join a car share program like Car2Go, where you get to own a car without really having to own a car, or by owning a car with multiple of your friends. So maybe 3 of your friends get together and you own a car together and share it. Driving less, if you do own a car, that's a simple one. If you ride a bike, getting a bike rack, which is where you can put panniers on the back, so that way you can go grocery shopping with your bike and be able to carry stuff or run any errands. Public transportation, a big one is living near the places that you spend most of your time. That way you have to spend a lot less time in transportation. And then walking. And so, and then the very last thing is that of all the philanthropy in the world that exists, only 3% goes to environmental nonprofits. So one of the another simple thing we can do is support the environmental nonprofits that are already doing this work. So, $100, for example, to an environmental nonprofit might mean hundreds of pounds of trash cleaned up or hundreds of pounds of food rescued and fed to people in need. So either donating to nonprofits or volunteering at nonprofits. And one of the big ways to change your life is to surround yourself with the things that you want to be. So ultimately, volunteering, you often receive far more than you give by spending that time volunteering. So there's a group called 1% for the Planet, and that's where you make a commitment to give 1% of your revenue or your income to grassroots environmental nonprofits. You give directly to them, and they certify you, and it's just a great way to be able to support the nonprofits that are right here in Vienna that are cleaning up the world. So that's everything. So now we have time for questions? Cool.